Good morning, my friends who are attending the meeting of Chico Xavier's meeting, this international event, which I've never dreamed of participating when I first joined the Spirit doctrine officially in this incarnation back in 1998. Being here means more than acknowledging the life and work of Chico Xavier, but also learning more about the extent of the influence of Chico Xavier in our lives, particularly to those who dedicated himself so much as his friends, but also those who needed his Christian example of goodwilling. And I beg Jesus to sustain us during these minutes. We'll be together to talk about Chico, who's not only the Brazilian yokel, a character considered the greatest Brazilian of all times, but somebody who transforms our lives every day through his books, through his life, and also through his magnificent example of kindness. So, the relevance of Chico Xavier for the new generations has to do with an active religiosity built on charity, on active charity, much more than his philosophical messages he supplies us with. Since the magnificent works of Humberto de Campos, the Emmanuel's lucubrations, and the anthropology, the anthropological research of André Luiz, we have all these messages. We have a countless collection of philosophical messages regarding the spiritual nature, our essence. But I have to admit that there was something odd when I was young. When I was 9 years old, I was on vacation in Criciúma with some cousins. And an aunt of mine, she played the song Jovem Galileu from Priest Zezinho. And I don't know why, I was touched while looking at some albums and photos, and that song started to play and I started to cry, and I couldn't help myself when I listened to that Jovem Galileu song. And even frustrated with the absence of answers at the time from this loving church who embraces so many souls and has so many ministries servicing millions of people in hospitals and orphanages. But I didn't have answers to ease my heart. So when I was invited, or better, referred by a friend who used to work with me when I was an intern at a police station, my friend Claudette, it took me only 20 minutes in the Spirit House to understand I belonged there. So my gratitude to Chico Xavier is immense, because he has not touched only me, but thousands and millions of youngsters are touched by his work. These youngsters who are trying to study, to understand, to improve themselves through the moral lessons of his work. And I told you that because it called my attention then the amount of texts where Jesus was sending messages inside Chico Xavier's work. And I found that curious, because sometimes it appeared in Humberto de Campos' book, sometimes in Paul and Stephen, like 2,000 years ago, there was a message from Jesus. And they were not any messages. They were relevant messages. And as time went by, I noticed that these messages, they were spread. They were like treasures placed in all places of Chico Xavier's work, sometimes in a book of messages, saying that Jesus did that at a certain time in a poetical way, like for Humberto de Campos in the book Brazil, The Heart of the World. He tells us about Jesus, mentions how Brazil was idealized based on its geofences features, which allowed our pioneers to extend our territory. And the original elements, people like the Portuguese, gathered to indigenous and also Africans to build this giant nation, which was led until the declaration of the Republic by the spirituality per se. So we started to notice that there was another gospel within the work of Chico Xavier, a gospel according to the Spiritists, not Luke's, Mark's, or Matthew's. A gospel according to Chico Xavier, dictated by the superior spirits and filled with this feeling of longing Jesus. We decided to gather, three friends and I, these messages, which we researched in around 400 to 500 works we could access, and which gave birth to the research we submitted to our friend Geraldo Lemos Neto from Vinha de Luz publisher, and maybe it will be available to everybody. But during this journey, seeing Jesus reaching so many people, we understand better the parables. We understand better the central axis of the Jesus' concerns about our lives. And from that, we understand why Paul, in his wisdom, in his Greek, Roman, and Hebrew training, he gave up everything to follow the gospel. It mentions Apollo, who was a Christian, a Greek Christian, and he says why he did that. He understood the superiority of the gospel before any human knowledge for the redemption of souls. We are not talking about giving up any useless culture. We are talking about the redemption we are searching for by practicing our spirituality, our religiosity on earth. This is what we search for. So the impact of the Chico Xavier for the generations, particularly to mine from 80s on, is huge. It touched the heart of all religions. It wakes the respect of several kinds of people. I had the chance to talk to an evangelist friend of mine, and among other things, he mentioned Paul and Stephen. I got shocked. How come you read Paul and Stephen? Yes, I have, and the book is wonderful. But he's still evangelical. This is wonderful. There was a time Hilda Tavares told me that Chico Xavier mentioned that in the future we'll have the Catholic mystic, the study by the evangelicals, and also the spirit chariot gathered. And then I could realize that Chico Xavier was right. We are connecting to one another. And as some anthropologists already said, Chico Xavier was the mediator of national culture. And there's academic research, like in the University of Rio Grande do Sul, saying that. So if we know that we are before so many texts, we are so happy that we could gather over 500 pages of messages by Jesus in the work of Chico Xavier. And to my surprise, during this research, we have asked to some friends, among them Flávio Tavares, if these messages from Maria Dolores in poetical ways and other which mentions visits of Jesus were true. And he said, yes, Chico revealed to Clovis, his dad, that indeed all mentions of Jesus coming to earth are true. And this has filled our heart with joy, because our Christ, although mighty and powerful and creator of this earth, he's simple, and he still worries about us. And Chico was a beloved disciple of Jesus. He was present here, translated to us the best perspective of Jesus' kingdom, abnegation, love, and charity. And I think of the reasons of Chico Xavier's come to Brazil, come to the world. Because when we think of his works among the needs and among his friends, we sometimes forget that it was not any work, it was not any spirit. Remember that Chico would wanted to get married and have children, but he had the goal of writing 100 books. He wrote it and asked to Emmanuel if he was released of his duty. And Emmanuel says, Jesus, not any other benefactor, no matter how important he is, but Jesus has confiscated your incarnation. So like him or not, he would have to disincarnate at that moment. So this is Chico Xavier. Being a benefactor, a Jesus messenger. It's not by any chance that Jesus confided him details of his visits, of the periods he visited the earth to Chico, because Chico was not just a spokesperson. He was a really beloved disciple. And maybe will take centuries to understand what he was doing, apart from what we know here on earth. And we know that many spirits who are now reincarnated or in the spiritual plane, they have followers, armies. We know that wars many times are happening in both spiritual and material planes due to among fanatics and nationalists. And when we have, for instance, his great friend Clovis Tavares in touch with Jesus Gonçalves through the friendship of Chico Xavier, we can understand the backstage of the reincarnation, of his reincarnation. Clovis Tavares was the king of France in century 5, 6 of the Christian age. He engaged in battle against the Visigoths of Alarico and Alarico II. So Alarico II particularly. So they engaged in these battles. The Visigoths were invading the Iberian Peninsula. And centuries later, Jesus Gonçalves would be Richelieu, who accepted, who was had a passion for the state, although he was a priest, but he tolerated Descartes, who allowed the Spiritists emerge as a science. And without the scientific method, the world wouldn't be as it is today. Without René Descartes, who founded the basis of what Allan Kardec says when Allan Kardec says that there's God, spirit, and the matter as the composing the universe, and also about the pineal gland, as André Luiz studies, and when he set so many parameters which can be studied and also measurable, the knowledge had other perspectives. Allan Kardec used the Cartesian method, not this one which is criticized today, but of the modern science. And the Spiritist magazine will praise Descartes as the one who allowed the birth, who gave birth this doctrine, the Spiritist doctrine. And Richelieu, the book of Descartes was submitted to Richelieu, who accepted, but we know he suffered a lot due to the wars, the invasion to Rome, but he was there in Rio, in Brazil, and he could be in fraternal contact with Clovis through Chico Xavier. If we can imagine the hordes, the armies, the followers of Clovis, who was a character apart from being the first French king, or Louis in French, among all Vespasian 2,000 years ago, and the father of Titus, he had so many followers. So, from enemies, centuries ago, he became friends during this reincarnation. So, Chico Xavier wouldn't promote the peace of thousands and millions of spirits who engaged in battle centuries and centuries ago, looking for power, in search for territories. So this raises the question that we are certain that Chico was not here just for the ride. He did much more than we think, than we dream of. And maybe by approaching spirits of different ethnicities while reincarnated, and who had people who followed them faithfully, maybe he has prevented future wars. Maybe he has prevented future conflicts. So Chico is certainly a civic milestone. And I say that the same way that Time magazine says that the most important man of the millennium was St. Francis of Assisi. If we could say, without a doubt, that Chico Xavier was one of the most important men in the history of mankind, particularly after Jesus. We had Socrates, we had Moses, we had Alexander the Great, each of them with their rights and wrongs. But in this millennium, post-Jesus, for sure, Chico Xavier has been the greatest man of the mankind. And I'm sure we are going to understand that later. So these agreements between nations, maybe we'll understand how they worked through their leaderships. The leaderships that are reincarnating and getting to find answers and also are working together for the redemption of their souls. And this is what will make a difference for us. I say that before our smallness compared to all these names and friends of Chico Xavier, because every time that I'm touched by a message, Jesus' message in the work of Chico Xavier, I'm glad. There was one that marked me particularly, and it made me really well. And it's in the book Good News, in the chapter Good Spirit, where we see the lovely character that Humberto de Campos introduces as Bartholomeus, one of the most faithful disciples of Jesus. When he says about what pleased him in Jesus' message, he said about the hope of a new kingdom, because he didn't fit in the parameters of his life. And then Jesus is going to say, my kingdom is not of this world, but I also came to change this world. And this is so powerful. For sure, our priority is spiritual, but Jesus came to change our world, and our contribution for that to happen is really key. And then Jesus says, have you seen a good news that doesn't bring any happiness? And then he presents us, you do well to keep your hope in the face of the new learnings, but I only want to kindle good cheer in the spirits of my disciples. If I have already that opportunity to teach, my kingdom is not of this world, this does not mean that I disdain the work of extending it one day to the hearts that toil on earth. Do you think, then, that I would have come into this world without the comforting certainty? Jesus is certain of the change in our world. The gospel will first have to flourish in the souls of creatures before it bears fruit for people's spirit. That's why I mentioned this capacity when Clovis and Jesus Gonçalves, Alarico II, gathered. We can see the gospel flourish in the soul of two creatures, and which will bear fruits to the souls of their peoples, as they have an influence over thousands of spirits. But my father comes full of strength and confidence, and my message will reach everybody. And this is really key. The Christian joy expressed by St. Francis of Assisi and Chico Xavier's. Everybody who met him tell us about his simple manner and joyful. So our spirits, I mean, the blessings from heaven should be full of joy. And before all these questions we are involved, it's been calling my attention the works, the social works that Chico left us as an example. Why are they important? Because Clovis himself, which he left, such as like Hilda, like others, works of great importance in the goodness, services for the poor, because Jesus reminded us through a message to Matthew about the kingdom of heaven, about a question if this kingdom was also to eligible people, for people who are ready, but if it was for everybody, for poor. Matthew thought that maybe he should expel people who are not ready, who are not eligible. And Jesus invited him to reflect upon that through the Beatitudes. And these Beatitudes to the people who suffer, to the persecuted, the people who have hunger and thirst for justice. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's one that marked my heart, together with this matter involving the sadness in Bartholomew's heart. And when Matthew hear this preaching by Jesus, another day he welcomed people in his house, and Jesus he was welcoming everybody and was really happy about that. Jesus was really glad and said, blessed the ones who listen and understand. So it's necessary that we understand Jesus. And Bartholomew, coming back to Good News chapter, he felt sad. He felt he didn't have financial conditions to realize his dreams. He compared himself to other guys, and he felt bad, like low self-esteem, as so many people do today. So when Jesus says, but what about the richness of heaven and the eternal richness you are about to be in touch with? And he gets touched by Jesus' words. And then he walks from the place where they were, some 4 to 6 miles. And when he gets home, his father throws something at him, insults him, because he was with Jesus. His siblings are outraged. And he had that profound talk to Jesus, and he was melancholic. He had a kind of depression. He gets calm, he doesn't argue, and he works with his friends. This Jesus' disciple was sad. He had a depression. He had to work for a living. He had to hear insults from his family. But he was eligible as a Jesus disciple. So we are also eligible. And this extract marked me so much. I can also be a disciple of Jesus. I can also be a disciple of Jesus. I can also serve the needy. Because Jesus was really clear about the path to be followed. And he prepared all his sons and daughters, prepared to follow this route. Through Chico Xavier, Mother Teresa, and so many others along the stories, Saint Vincent de Paul, Mary Magdalene. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was in prison, and you came to me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was a stranger, and you invited me. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Before this overwhelming truth, no matter the noble, the cult a spirit is, a spiritist is, a Christian is, without charity, he's nothing. Without charity, you are nothing. James himself, in his epistle, of the gospel, he reminds us that faith without charity is dead. Faith without works is dead. How come, he asks, somebody who's hungry believe and be evangelized? How come the person understands something when he feels cold? So faith without works is dead. Therefore, we who are touched by discussions around the truth, the righteousness, we are going to get this message by Humberto de Campos from Chronicles of Beyond the Grave, where he sends a letter to Rio de Janeiro mayor when an institution who serviced many people stopped receiving funds which had been promised by the public power. A situation that took place some time ago, it's not new, concerning the shelter Teresa de Jesus. And then he tells us a story of that Jesus had met eminent theologians, philosophers, artists, mathematicians, literary men, and among other things, Jesus said, all your sciences are respectable, but they value little if you have no charity. All the wisdom without kindness is like light which doesn't heat and flower that doesn't perfume. The human happiness is solved in the practice of my gospel. And our algebraic solution solves a question, but the charity is the solution. So, this sentence alone is enough for us to understand what we are looking for, what we are dealing with when it comes to the challenges the life offers us. And there's another message that marked me when the disputes in the psychic writing of Chico Xavier told by Emmanuel in Paul and Stephen. We know that Antioch, the Church of Antioch, which Paul was associated with, it had a great work, a rare mediumistic phenomena in that community. And Paul had understood that Christianity was the religion for all people. So Paul is responsible for turning Christianity into a non-ethnic religion. So if it was not for Paul, Christianity would be an extension of Judaism. Not that Judaism is not something good. It's just that the Judaism back then was related to a race. Like today we have the Jews and African ethnicities and others. But it was necessary that they break the idea of segregation, because Jesus came for everybody. He was the governor of the planet. So from this understanding, Paul's understanding, he tries to convince Peter and creates an atmosphere of a certain dispute. So we'll see the brother Timothy trying to convince Paul. He was an apostle of Christ. How could he say that? But when Peter went to visit Paul in Antioch, he was happy, but then people from Jerusalem came and he stopped eating at the table together with the ones who were not Jews. That's complex. And then he returned to Jerusalem later to talk to James and Paul so that they could come to an agreement around involving the Gentiles, the non-Jews, like us. In that would be perhaps the first council after Jesus came to earth. And it could change the mankind, the history of mankind. And we know that Jesus will tell John the evangelist that if it was not for his intervention, maybe Paul and Peter had become enemies. So you'll have to check that reading. When Peter goes to Jerusalem to talk to them, then we have a lesson for every one of us who are sectarians. A chaotic situation at the house of the disciples in the capital, Jerusalem. A number of difficulties. And to look at the outburst of Peter, I'm going to bring here. So when the situation got worse, I thought of going to another community. Then I thought of engage in battle and react. But then I prayed in my room and I noticed the presence of somebody who arrived. He disagreed of Paul, but he didn't fight. Spirits cannot argue with one another. That's what I want to say. So I was on my knees when the door was opened, and it was a great surprise to me. It was Master. His face was the same as the Tiberius days. He looked at me with severity and tenderness and told me, Peter is saying to Paul the experience he had. Take a look at this Jesus message. Peter, service the Calvary's sons before indulging your whims. If our lucubrations, if our dilemmas, our worries, our philosophical issues, if you cannot understand this Jesus sentence, service, help the Calvary's children before you indulge your whims. So we don't know what we are doing in Spiritism. Maybe we are more of a hindrance than a help. Because if a Jesus disciple couldn't be responsible for helping the needy, what about us? How much we have to work before we can write, before we can speak, and project ourselves in the world. So these works, these simple works of the Spiritist centers, institutions, and so many others which do the good and who prove the good we do. So there's no way that we should indulge our whims over the needy, the sectarians, the segregationists. So this has everything to do with the being faithful with one another. Also like Judas. Judas didn't agree with Jesus, with his way of doing things. But when Mary Magdalene goes to Jesus, which was told in the book Heart and Life of Mary Dolores, take a look of these Jesus' words to her, which was told by Chico Xavier in his other gospel of him. No, Mary, I did not go to the heights, nor did I rise even a hand in the light of the sky. Whoever loves cannot find the sky with a leap instead of ascending to the high splendors. I went down, but I went down a lot to the lower realms. Waking up in the grave, I heard the cries of distress from someone I loved very much and still love very much. Although I could see beyond the ever more beautiful light, I felt in that someone a beloved companion in crisis of sadness and madness. I went to the abysmal shadow for a great search, and when I found him again bitter and mad, to the point of not recognizing me anymore, I spent some time caressing him, and little by little I managed to finally get him to sleep. And then Magdalene said, who friend is that? Mary, a friend doesn't forget the pain of another friend who falls. A friend doesn't forget the pain of another friend who falls. Before rising to heavenly joy, to the sun of the same love for God in which you rise, I used myself after the cross of the great silent towers and descended into darkness, in order to alleviate the immense pain of Judas. If we consider that somebody's as a traitor or who doesn't understand us, we should follow Jesus. Or will be on the command of another Lord. We have different conditions. People mention the attitude of Chico Xavier to other people, but we are not Chico Xavier. We have not made the good he did, so we cannot compare ourselves to Chico Xavier. Neither in this reincarnation we could do what he did, neither in other reincarnations of hymns. Let's not copy Chico Xavier in everything, because we lack the essential part. His kindness, only someone who did the good he did can be like him. Let's say that André Luiz is the good that you do speaks for you. This is multiplied in the life of Chico Xavier. So we have to do a lot of good to be different from what Jesus treated Judas. So if Jesus treated Judas like that, what will be with us? What will happen to us? So, before this invitation that we are made, that we are offered, even James, when he was helping the sick people, and being insulted by some of those he helped. And he was really upset the way he was being treated. So Jesus come and say, I came not to this world to cure the healthy people. In the book Augusto Vive, So, if the disciples are invited to renunciation, so we also are. And we are in a more profound way than we can imagine. So, what will happen to us if we don't dedicate to one another? What will be left of us? In the chapter, in the name of the Gospel of Chico Xavier's Unpublished, there's an invitation for us to understand that all of us are part of a great regeneration work through the Gospel. Without the Gospel, the Christian Spiritism and the ones who lead the spirits, we can't change the spiritist environment in a greater place. In a troubled world, or rather, gathered in a great conclave of fraternity, like the one we are in, may the brothers of Brazil focus more and more on the service and renunciation, solidarity and pure kindness that Jesus bequeathed to us. The troubled world effectively calls for transformative action. Be aware, however, that the redemption of the whole is impracticable without the prolongation of the parts. We should walk together in the same itinerary of love, work, education, solidarity that characterize the attitude of Christ in communion with men, serving and mirroring the future in his example of self-denial in sublime harmony with the designs of the Supreme Lord. So it's necessary that we become more and more fraternal, more and more, and that we understand that, in fact, we are going to know the truth, and the truth will set us free. But it's important that we understand this message that Jesus said to Bartholomew in the chapter Good Spirit of the book Good News. When Bartholomew asks if the gospel demands strength all the time, because it's necessary to be strong. Let's say what Jesus says, because if we say that we know the truth and the truth will set us free, take a look at what he says. The truth doesn't demand, it transforms. Therefore, all who are concerned about the truth understand this message together with me, so that we can create a great fraternal environment in the house of Ishmael, which is the Spiritist doctrine. Each Spiritist center, Spiritist group, community, WhatsApp group, each of us are a small center. That we can understand that the truth doesn't demand, transforms. The gospel could not claim special status from its disciples, but it's necessary to consider that joy, courage, and hope must be constant traits of their activities each day. And when we have become discouraged, why hold on to the hour-long nightmare when we know the glorious reality of eternity with our Father? So, we are invited to understand that although the truth will set us free, the truth doesn't demand, it transforms, so that in the future we can remember that it's not outside the truth that there's no salvation, it's outside charity. Chico was the example of love and abnegation his whole life. And in the messages by Jesus, his disciples, his stories, we should supply ourselves in order to minimize the longness we have from Jesus. It was really great to be here with you. I'm sorry for my smallness compared to so many important people. My friends, my beloved friends, be all blessed. In the name of Jesus, we can do as they did in the school of Christ, helping the needy in the distribution of bread, that we can do as our friends of Alvorecer, or the Casa of Pão, or the Lar of Caridade, because an institution like this, when we talked about the conciliation of the people, so if we imagine Lar da Caridade, which embraced Mussolini for his respective reincarnations, there's no work in goodness that doesn't bear fruits. Even if we can't eat them, sometimes some trees will bear fruits in some centuries, but they are important to rise our soul. But it's key that we remember that the gospel of Jesus is not a dead work. It's a living work of joy and hope. That's why we should remember Chico Xavier. He said if he had the opportunity to put a warn, to put a sentence at the entrance of the city, it wouldn't be love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself, but instead would be love one another as I have loved you, remembering of Jesus, so that we could love one another as Jesus loved us and still loves us since the way we were conceived by our Father. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you came to me. I was sick and you visited me. I was a stranger and you invited me in. So let's engage in these works. Chico Xavier will sustain us. Amen.